So thanks so much, Francois, for this very intriguing discussion. And so we'll now take 20 minutes for comments and questions, and then proceed with the next speaker. So anyone has any questions or comments? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Uroš Budin. I have a question. You mentioned that the redistribution effect would be roughly 2%, maybe a little less for developed countries like Germany. Do we have any comparison to the current European budget and its redistributing mechanisms? So is this politically, let's say, acceptable for...
That's a good question. I don't have actually the figures of the national contribution by Germany for the European budget, but the European budget is so small that I guess it would be much less, of course, than the European the amount that Germany would have to contribute for the European dividend. So yes, it's still a big amount to accept. Yeah.
Thanks. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Presentation, financing of such an income would mainly come from taxes. Now, if you wish to convince the European public, either decision makers or just people around, I think they would not like additional taxes for the payment of some kind of basic income. On the other hand, irrespective of what member states contribute to the European budget, inside the European budget, there is, as far as I know, the largest share going to the common agricultural policy. So what I perhaps missed in this presentation, it's really reallocation, not only of the European Social Fund, but within the EU budget. And I'm quite convinced there is some potential therein. So I would like to know if you have studied this as well.
I will leave the mystery on that subject because Aurélie is going to do a presentation exactly on the idea of an agrarian basic income at the European level, and I'm sure she will be able to answer that question better. But allow me to say that if you have a European tax and there's a tangible benefit for European citizens, the link between this tax and its redistribution is fairly visible. So even though you might say that citizens don't want additional taxes, they might be able to really make the link between this tax and what the European Union is doing for them. Also, it is important to make the case that at the national level there might be some readjustments. This bottom layer that the euro dividend would be about would be also a way to reduce some of the expenses for the national budget. The amount that would be given to the European level in VAT might also be a way to reduce the expense. Well, the national governments would have to take back what it's losing in other ways, such as tax exemptions on the lower part of the income. That is these kind of subsidies that are now, for example, given at national level. So you might have to make the case of what is now given to the European level and what we can gain at the national level as well, and how it might support also national budgets in that sense.
Comment on very much in the same direction. I think our Nordic participants here can confirm that actually people are okay with paying taxes, even high taxes, if they know what they get out of it, so for their taxes. And I think that's also the problem we have in the European debate on contributions to the EU budget. So for example, the perception in Germany is that, you know, it's a kind of deep hole where you just throw in your money and it ends up in Greece or Portugal or somewhere where they lie in the sun all day long on our money. And I think that's why this question of how high the EU budget should be is so difficult to tackle on a political level, whereas economists, especially in aftermath of the euro crisis, tend to agree that if we want to keep the Eurozone together, if you want to protect it against asymmetric shocks, if we actually really want to take all this economic convergence idea seriously, we need a much higher redistribution on European level. So, which I mean, I think even the most modest suggestions speak about 5% of GDP as a first step, whereas, as we know, the present redistribution is around 1%. So I think that's why this idea with the European basic income can be also politically very successful, because every person gets something out of it. You know, okay, we might contribute as country more to it than I think in Germany than in Slovenia, but still each German citizen would get the same amount like each Slovenian citizen. So I think politically this is really a crucial point, why we can also, which can also help to connect these debates. So a lot of economists speak about this shock absorbers and financial instruments to stabilize Eurozone, European budget, but they don't speak about basic income. So that's how we can push basic income into that debate.
We've got 10 more minutes. Go ahead.
Let's say European budget is approximately 1% of GDP. If we talk seriously about European Union, it should be at least 6%. And who would agree on 6% if they quarrel about 1% of 1%? So there is no political possibility for the time being to introduce that. We can calculate whatever we want, but these are mainly more or less illusions as long as GDP, as share of European budget in GDP is 1%.
Right, so that's another view on the topic. Would anyone want to comment?
I missed something because, in fact, the sound was not perfect. There is a lot of echo, and well, I will invite all the future speakers that they focus on the microphone quite nearly, because otherwise the others, we will not hear them perfectly. But I didn't hear anything about addressing the possible problems that I see if there is this strong European universality, since the same amount of money given to the north of Europe, to the people, and on the south of Europe will produce different effects. It's giving different buying power to people. What's about that?
As I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be. Is it working? Yeah. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same amount given to all countries. Of course, that's a very strong symbolic thing to have the same amount, because it means that there is one European Union with European citizens, and they are entitled to the same amount as a materialization of social citizenship. Redistribution effect would be much higher, but it will have very pernicious effects in terms of, for example, if you look at the median income in Bulgaria or Romania, this amount might be very important. But if now you look at it in terms of purchasing power parity, then the effect, the fear you're mentioning might be much more reduced.
Thanks. We have Branko there and then Ulrich.
Yeah. I saw something, as Dr. Jože Menzinger and Igor says, and Felicità and so on, that's a problem that we have to realize. Introducing basic income will change our society, will change the understandings of GDP, will change the understandings of tasks and so on. And these are the problems we have to meet. How these are philosophical and ethnological and psychological problems. How the society will work in the circumstances of introducing basic income and so other. We are speaking about European basic income. It's not possible. It's just on the world. And that's another big task. We can't say that without war we get that 500 million people will get a basic income and 2 or 5.5 billion people will not have. That's not possible.
I think, yes, that's the main problem. That's a very big step from 1% to 20%, even with the possibility of a national readjustment in social welfare system. This big change from national welfare schemes to a European welfare scheme, at minimum a partly European welfare scheme, this big change can only be made step by step. We must keep the goal in our brain and in the public to argue, but it's not possible to have it at Monday morning. So, because yes, every nation must have the possibility, and not only the nations, but the people and the companies must have enough space to mitigate their economical behavior and so on.
I don't have a question. It's a little bit more just comment to your presentation. You started with some kind of economic arguments before physiological and political arguments. For my point of view, it's a little bit problematic, not your presentation, but all debates, scientific or political debates, we always start with the question how to afford basic income, how to find taxes and so on. For me, maybe it's more important, or I can say it's easier to promote basic income also on the level of European Union if we firstly answer the question why we need basic income. And when we know why we need it, it's a little bit easier to say in which form and how to afford it and so on. It's just a comment. It's not really a question or a critic. That's it.
It's just a comment. Allow me to answer, because I completely agree with you. And I started with economic arguments mainly for pragmatic reasons, because of previous experiences. People are not necessarily interested in the more theoretical aspects of justifying the European universal basic income. But for me, the link should be very clear between what we have in mind in terms of redistribution based on social justice argument at the political theory level, and then the way its economic funding should happen in order to build coherence between theoretical and pragmatic arguments. And for me, this debate on social justice, and we can always discuss about that during the break, is the whole chicken or egg dilemma in terms of solidarity solidarity at the European level? Should we have first a European demos and then we will have the social bond that legitimizes redistribution at the European level? Or should we say the European institutions are already here, they have a pervasive impact on the lives of individuals, they are winners and losers between national member states, and therefore we should have some kind of redistribution, and this might be the way to bring forward this solidarity bond, this social bond, this European demos. I argue that social justice and solidarity should come first as a result of the institutions that we have, and that the European public sphere might grow in parallel with all this, rather than hoping for one day having a European demos and then put forward new ideas. So I agree with you, and thank you for that comment.
Thanks. Yeah, Urbana?
It's a bit hard to expect of European Union that they will sort of jump to this idea of regulating the social policy area in different national states, because as we can learn from the history, this has always been a problem with European Union. This is especially the area which has, in my opinion, which is at least regulated by the EU. So this is really up to the national states to come up with this, I don't know, new ideas. So my question would be, I mean, what kind of new strategies would you suggest in order to tackle this issue?
To be honest, I don't have one specific strategy because it's a very good question. Social policy or social protection is an exclusive competence of the national welfare state, but there are room for maneuver for the European Commission as to support national welfare states in terms of tackling poverty, social exclusion, and the labor market policies as well, where we have now funds for training, the youth guarantee and stuff like that. So maybe there are ways to use this existing European support to build some consensus towards a European support in terms of basic income. So it's not European, the EU would not be interfering directly in social policy at the national level. It might be supporting the different welfare arrangements, but it might still be a national competence. So there's not necessarily a need to interfere with subsidiarity, but it's another layer. And I'm sure Stan wants to add something.
I want to have a question to your statement in the last part of your presentation, where you have said about the limitations of changing the treaty of the Lisbon Treaty. My question is, should we, because of these problems which we have discussed, really ask that the competence for social aspects should be given at least partly much more to the EU, and the national aspects for that should be reduced, so that we can have common European solidarity effects.
I was actually going to expand on this. So your response to Urban was, this can work within the subsidiarity principle, if I'm correct, without need to change it. I would even agree there are arguments for changing it, in the sense that Klaus said, and say, well, actually, we do need some sort of solidarity or welfare at international level. Why? Because globalization is affecting people at least regional level, if not global, right? So a good governance principle is that you should have policies at the level where the problem is, right? And the problem right now is because of international trade and everything, you know? So actually it makes sense that part of it should be also made EU-wide, at least because that's where we have the most advanced governance. But actually this is the most tricky thing. I think the euro dividend, the this notion that we should have solidarity at international level is more radical than basic income itself. I think that's really what we have to be aware of, is that basic income at national level is one thing. It's all the ethics behind it, and it's already very radical, but telling people that this should be also applied at international level is even more radical. But I'm not pessimistic, but we have to be aware of this. This is the real challenge.
I agree, and there's this clear asymmetry between economic integration and social integration, and there should be at the same level, ideally. But my response was mostly in terms of this reluctancy that member states have to transfer sovereignty on that matters, because it's one of the most important part of their political power, political bargaining at national level, and that's where the difficulty lies. But I agree with you that we might need to go forward with a European social welfare layer much faster than we are actually doing now.
Thanks. We'll have to wrap it up soon. We have another comment over there.
Yes, I want to argue a little bit with this approach that big changes are not possible. So if we are thinking what kind of huge fantasy amounts of money were conjured up to tackle the financial crisis, and instruments like the Stability Fund and Stability Mechanism, etc., were introduced also actually outside of the EU budget, then you see that it's possible to separate these also public debates. So one possible solution would be, especially if you have a very simple concept of really not taking purchasing power into account, but really giving the same amount to everybody, where there is no big, need for political negotiations, then you can do it outside of the EU budget with setting up a fund, so officially the money would not even go to the EU, or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying that's my favorite solution, but I'm just saying there are possibilities also to tackle. One more point, we had with Francois, we had a meeting with the former Social Affairs Commissioner Laszlo Andor in Brussels to discuss this topic. And what he said I found very interesting, that one of the problems of this proposal is that it has too many beneficial points. So there are actually too many ways to argue for it. So you can argue on the macroeconomic stabilizer, on solidarity, on transfers, whatever. And he said that politically it would be much stronger and useful if we find one argument, a very strong argument, so which he suggested to for example, focus on poverty eradication, that to sell this, at least if not to the politicians, but at least to people everywhere.
Before finishing, just to add one small comment, he also mentioned, and it's something I didn't mention in the presentation, that we also should focus mostly on the change, the technological change, and that might be one of the strongest arguments in favor of basic income in his view. He was rather skeptical on the macroeconomic stabilizing effect, because it's a permanent thing and not responding to cyclical conjectures. So that's also, and I think he's a bit skeptical about the idea of basic income itself, actually. But he has his own baby to promote with the European Unemployment Insurance Scheme, so maybe that's why.
Thanks, Francois. We have one last comment. No? Okay. So thanks so much. I think this is evolving into a very fruitful debate. Now we'll continue with Aurélie Ampal. She's a secretary of UBIE, a member of French Basic Income Group, and a coordinator of the Agrarian UBI project in France. And she will be talking about the agrarian basic income.